Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Stephen. We are very lucky today that we have Stephen Barker, who's joining us from England. And he's a heritage advisor, he's a curator, he's an author. He also conducts heritage tours. His specialty is war history. So he has also advised and curated exhibitions all over England related to this topic. We were going to talk to him more in specific with a new book which he has just written, which is just published in England and just published in India. It's a book called The Flying Sikh. And Stephen will tell us a lot about the book and where he gets his research from and what interests him in war history. It's not always a very pleasant topic, right, for research. Definitely not for the faint-hearted. So, yes, Stephen, you're welcome. Most welcome to the Museum Memories Project. And we are very honored that you've taken out time for this interview. And we will be posting this interview on the YouTube channel under Impresario Heritage Foundry. So, yes, Stephen, please tell us about your book, your brand new, fresh new book.
Well, Palumi, thank you very much for having me on your channel today. Always great to be involved with you. Yeah, the book, it's called The Flying Sikh in England, but of course, there's only one Flying Sikh in India, and that's Milka Singh. So the book in India, published by HarperCollins at the end of June, is going to be called The Lion of the Skies, The Lion of the Skies. And it's the story of Hardit Singh Malik, who came from Rawalpindi, born in 1894, and came to England in 1909 as a 14-year-old for his education. And during the First World War, he was the only Sikh flyer amongst a number of Indians who enlisted with the Royal Flying Corps. That's the equivalent of the Indian Air Force today. And he fought in some important battles during the First World War. And that's the subject of the book. I should say that he also had a fascinating life after the First World War. He became India's first commissioner to Canada, and then after partition, he became India's first ambassador to Paris. He was a fluent French speaker, and not only that, as if he wasn't talented and had an interesting life as it was, he was also a cricketer who played first-class cricket in England, and also India's premier golfer in the 1920s and the 1930s, along with his brother Iqbal. The book is based on a memoir that he wrote from the 1960s onwards. But that memoir, from my point of view as a military historian, gave more questions than answers. And I suspected that there was more to the story of Hardit Singh Malik, and I was absolutely right. There was much more to the story. And what has excited me about writing the book is the fact that I've been able to shed light on things that he actually never knew in his lifetime, or at least never spoke about.
So, if I may ask you, I'm sorry, I use the term war history. It's actually appropriate as military history. So you've written in the book. So for those of us who have not been able to read the book in India, how did you come across this particular topic, military history? And why did it interest you, and why Hardit Singh Malik?
Well, let's just stay with Malik for a moment. I'm a heritage advisor, a museum consultant, self-employed. I've been doing that for 12 years now. And during the centenary of the First World War, I was looking for case studies, stories of individuals who represent a diverse war. Often in Great Britain, there's a great deal of focus on the Western Front, in what happened in France and Belgium, but it was a genuine world war, and India's part in that war is very much outside the Western Front. Although there were Indian soldiers on the Western Front during 1914-15, their story is very much beyond the Western Front. And living and working in Oxfordshire as I do, I had come across Hardit Singh Malik about 10 years ago and wanted to include him in a number of exhibitions that I was designing and a number of projects. And he represents a very interesting and unique perspective on the First World War, which actually is the subject of the book. Going back to your other questions, I'm going to keep this short, Palumi, or else we could be here for some time. But what I'd like to know is that I grew up with people who were within my family who had fought in the First World War. My grandfather lost one of his brothers and two others fought. And some of those stories and some of the grief of that came down to me. And on my maternal mother's side, her father, my grandfather, he fought in the Second World War. And as a small child, I was very aware that he had a drawer full of memorabilia, and he also had a drawer full of wonderful stories that accompanied that collection of artifacts that he had collected. And those two connections, those familial connections with events greater than I could ever conceive, only in my history lessons. That was the power of the objects and the stories and the family connections. The fact that those connections linked me in these great events, the First World War and the Second World War, and that legacy has stayed with me.
So any specific reason why Indians appealed to you in the world wars? The role of Indians in specific? Is there any trigger?
Yeah, there is. Yes, there is. Commander of the India Corps, when he wrote his biography in 1921, he believed that the India Corps stories would not be told for all sorts of reasons, and I agree with that. And as I've researched the First World War, it's almost 35 years of research and interest in it. The story of the India Corps has still not been told, and there are reasons for that we don't have enough time to explore today. But there's a power in wanting to tell and being in a position where you can uncover hidden stories. And India's contribution to the First War is a major one in terms of manpower, in terms of economic activity, in terms of logistical support on behalf of the empire. And it's certainly something that people in Great Britain have not been aware of until the First World War centenary. In fact, quite a lot of research was carried out by a couple of organisations. About 40% of Britons knew about that contribution, and by the end of the centenary, that had doubled. And it was owing to the fact that projects like mine and the books that came out during the First World War, that people in Britain, but also I think many people in South Asia, began to reappraise India's contribution to that war. And it's because of all of that that I wanted to exploit it. And the way that I became engaged with it is that Britain's military museums, of which most counties, which are associated with our county regiment, so I work a lot in Oxfordshire, so we have, the regiment is the Oxfordshire Light Infantry. The Oxfordshire Light Infantry had a long heritage in India of service, going back into the 1790s. And of course, they played a part in the First War of Independence, in the rebellion of 1857. They were at the Siege of Delhi, at the Lahore Gate. That was where they saw service. And that service and their continual service through into the First World War is reflected in their archives. There are archives in that Oxfordshire Museum store which are from the Siege of Delhi, about 40 of them. And one of the main projects that I've been working on over the last few years was to enable people of South Asian heritage living in Britain to have access to those archives. And those archives have really breathed life into what the Indian contribution was. And also we encouraged those people, the volunteers, to actually take an active part in creating the interpretation for exhibitions that have toured all around Britain. And although my contribution over 4 or 5 exhibitions has been a small one, that sort of activity is replicated across Great Britain and enabling people from all backgrounds, and even if you're an aficionado of the First World War, that you get to reappraise that Indian contribution.
So another question that comes to my mind when you mentioned that it's your, the artifacts which triggered you to find out more. So for your book, not just this book, for any book, all the books that you have written, and for your research, and when you are curating exhibitions, this is a very kind of a general question that I'm asking, is that how much do you depend on research? How much do you depend on who said when? How much? What is your research? Where does your research begin? Right? Are you looking at journals, books, memoirs? Because they can be colored, right? Even oral history can be pretty emotional. So where do you sort of draw the line? And when you are writing, especially when you're writing this in specific with this book, do you see yourself as an observer? Are you a narrator? What are the roles that you're playing, and how do you carry out this entire process? Like, what is the process?
I see myself as someone who is reinterpreting, who is reappraising, who is re-representing stories. I'm only interested in producing a book if I feel, one, that there's a good narrative story, but secondly, I can shed new light or perspectives in the light of the things I've been talking about, actually, in relation to this book. So in relation to the diversity of the First World War, and in relation to India's contribution. And my starting point is always looking for new research. Facts are all important, of course, and that's the difference between history and memory. Just clarify that a little bit. Memory is about those things passed down through our families, through our communities, from our cultural background, but it often isn't history. And my starting point of fact, I'm looking for new research. I read around a story to understand what's been written about this subject before, to make sure I've got a sense of it. And then I start looking for a new perspective. But I can only do that because I've got a sense that only half a story's been told. And then I will go after it in a very direct fashion. And the way that I will do that, so I'm looking for facts. I will go to original archive source material, never secondary material, as the first port of call. And I will always leave behind current interpretations and my own beliefs and prejudices, and go back to the past for a true perspective that I'm looking at. So one may have a particular interpretation of Indian soldiers who fought on behalf of the empire in 1914 and beyond, but it's really important from the way that I work that you put yourselves back at that time, at the point of the decision making that they were having to make, the decisions that they were having to make, not in the light of a 21st century perspective. So I'm very much looking at that. I also follow the evidence. I follow the evidence, weigh the evidence as much as I can with honesty and integrity. Really interesting. I must just share this with you. It's an analogy that I use all the time. Barristers and lawyers cherry pick evidence. If there's 30 pieces of evidence, and 10 of them are in favor of their client, that barrister will focus only on the 10, even though the weight of evidence is against them. As a historian, you are not doing that. You are looking at all 30 pieces of evidence, and you convey the idea that 20 pieces of evidence are in the preponderance, but actually there is also evidence against, and these are the pieces. So it's also being able to contextualize and to interpret. And in order to do that, that's where I would bring secondary sources in. So once I'm happy that I've got a settled narrative, once I'm happy that I've got research material which augments, adds to, and really excites the story, then I will add some contextual, academic, and historical background material from secondary sources to set the whole thing in context. Context is really important. Within the Line of the Skies book, Malik himself, in his memoir, wrote very particularly about his own experience. And one of my frustrations reading it, great though it is, it's a really important memoir on its own, is the fact that there's no sense of what's happening in the world around him. I knew what was happening as I was reading that book, and he makes no mention of all sorts of contextual background pieces of information that I almost was certain that he knew. And of course, that's fine, because he was writing a memoir, a retrospective in later years. And why should he contextualize it? But as a historian, it was really important for me.
So it's hours of backbreaking work, sitting in the libraries, sitting in the archives, looking at original objects like the uniforms and the arms and weapons, and also, like you mentioned, you were talking about earlier to me, you were talking about how you got in touch with Malik's family members and how they helped you. They helped in sharing photographs from the family albums. So it's a lot of very hardcore fact finding in a very strict methodological, structured manner. So because this is a question, in today's world with an overload of information, we are faced with so much information on the internet that we don't exactly understand whom do we trust, which other sources we can trust, because every other person is saying that mine is authentic, so that's why this question comes, and especially, so when you're saying context and, if it makes the fact a little more exciting, then you go on to secondary source of material. Otherwise, it's mostly the primary sources that you're looking at. It just, something came to my mind that, you are a Britisher sitting in England and doing all this research on an Indian who grew up in India. And after a point, of course, he goes to England and then he travels the world over, and post-independence, he has a very different identity in India. He's highly respected. So when you are writing about such a person, are you conscious that it might be subject to all sorts of scrutiny? There might be, don't mind my saying this, there might be some fingers pointing to you, said, why do we believe a white man's perspective on an Indian, Sikh, who was part of the British army that the British didn't bother to acknowledge till so many years? So did that thought ever occur to you?
No, not at all. I think part of it is that if you follow the evidence, that gives you a confidence.
Can you give an example when you say follow the evidence? Could you just give one?
Yeah, I think so. I think, for example, there was a place where, for example, Malik is talking about aerial combat. He's talking about aerial combat against a very famous German fighter ace called Baron von Richthofen. You may have heard of him, and your listeners may have heard of him.
Yeah.
And Malik, in his autobiography, in his memoir, is convinced that he's fighting against Richtofen, because that was the Yasta, the squadron that was being sought out by Malik's flight commander on the 26th of October 1917. But the evidence is quite clear that both Malik and his flight commander, who's also who's called Captain Barker, he's no relation to me. Two of them believed they were in combat on that day, a really important day for Malik for another reason, against Richtofen. And there's a little bit of evidence that Richtofen's squadron was in the air, but the vast weight of the evidence is against that. And it was absolutely clear to me that both Malik and Barker were mistaken about that they were fighting another Yasta squadron. It's only a small example, but it's an important one, and it's repeated constantly both in South Asia and in Britain that Malik fought against Richtofen, and that's a good example of. Some people may be upset about that, but the evidence is clear that they were fighting not against Yasta 11, they were fighting against Yasta 18, which is another squadron altogether. And so am I over concerned that someone may be concerned about that? No, I'm not, because the evidence is clear to me. I followed the evidence, and as long as hand on heart, that's how I feel, and I know the process that I've gone through, that gives you a strength and a confidence to go ahead with it. And I think the second example is that there are a number of myths that I've come across Malik. Another good example that your listeners will be really interested in is that, for example, that he was shot down twice by the Germans, and that he was captured by the Germans, incarcerated, and then escaped twice from prisoner of war camp. It's not true.
It's not true.
100%. It's not true. It appears on internet websites. Malik's story is exciting and interesting and vibrant and admirable. It does not need embellishment. But I've occasionally seen, well, more than occasionally seen that repeated again and again, and it just isn't true. I've got all of his records which tell me all the significant moments of his career, and there are several duplicates of that document. That it's just not true. He makes no mention of it in his memoir, but someone has decided that the story needs to be embellished, that his story he needs to be turned into something that he isn't, and that's a really important point. As for it being written by a Britisher, quote unquote, there's been 100 years where somebody else could have written about Malik. 100 years has passed by. I didn't see a flock of people at the Indian Africa Archives in London, at the British Library, who were challenging me to write this book. They were not flocking there. No one else has been flocking there to write it. I will just do a shout out. Christy Campbell, the journalist and military historian, it was a path that he was treading, and he and I had a conversation about it, but no one else has been writing that book, and I felt very strongly it was a story that needs to be told. And the reasons for that is that I know of only a handful of Indian memoirs associated with the First World War, and two of them are from Bengali doctors in the Royal Army Medical Corps.
Okay.
And I would argue that the most important memoir is Malik's. The challenge for those interested in India's contribution in the First World War is that he's not a typical sepoy, is that he comes to Britain and he enlists in Britain's armed forces even as a proud Indian, a proud Punjabi, and a proud Sikh, and joins the Royal Flying Corps, and leaves us a unique testimony of what it was like to do that, but also what it was like to be someone who was serving indirectly on behalf of the British Empire and on behalf of India as part of India's contribution to the war. So it's a very unique memoir, Malik's own interpretation, and I've just tried to breathe life into it, and I hope I've achieved that.
Look forward to reading it in detail. And which brings me to the next question. Now that you've worked so many years on this, it occupied your big part of the lockdown. Do you feel like in kind of an emptiness? Is it all out? Like, is it over, your story with Malik? How, as an author, what's the kind of feeling that you have now? Is it like a sense of victory?
Well, this is my second major book. I've written a couple of other shorter volumes, but this is my second major book. Because it's only just been published, I'm not sure I can fully answer that at the minute. But as I am at the moment, I think that what's been fascinating is how much interest there's been in the book, and already there are some interesting interpretations about what I've written, particularly in England, because it's been published here already on the 30th of May. So it's the hard copies are going out, and so I'm sort of prepared to enter into a discussion about that. I do hope that I certainly don't intend to move on from it. I have another story, another project that I'm going to work on at the end of the year. But at the moment, I've given over time to be able to write articles and to do interviews like the one we're doing today. I've been asked to do quite a number of projects which are Malik related. So I'm happy to do all of that. And I hope it's a book and a project that will never fade, that it engages people, particularly in India, as it is today, and but also a story that deserves to be told, and as does India's contribution during the First World War.
Okay, you are also a heritage advisor. You curate. You have curated exhibitions. You work with museums. You help them archive. You also help raise funds. So could you tell us a bit about it? Your work.
Yeah, I make a living. Pardon me. Yeah, I make a living out of in this sector, making funding applications, and I've done 20 of them, I think, over 12 years. And I think that's the main element of what I'm doing. I'm looking to tie in educational aspects with audience development, with collections. Always that tie up, and I would argue that's my strength in the work that I carry out. I'm also I work for the Arts Council as well. I'm a museum mentor, so I support museums. I've had a couple of museums that I support through the accreditation program and process in Britain, which is enabling museums to reach standards of the highest caliber. So I do work on that as well. And exhibition design and project design as well. So sometimes I'll be brought in when a project has already got funding, I'm asked to work on an exhibition, or occasionally I will be asked to create the funding, and then I'm in a fortunate position where I can build myself into the project for which the funding will be successful, hopefully. But even if I say it myself, I've got a very successful record of applying for funding, and that's because I have a particular approach. I'm painstaking. I don't rush into it. I make sure that everything's thought through and that there's a comprehensive vision of what the project is aiming to achieve. And perhaps above all, that it meets the criteria which is laid out. Often that is, that's a surprise to me with some organizations with which I've worked, that it's clear what the criteria are, but there isn't sufficient focus on those criteria to bring a successful project to fruition, financial fruition. So knowing your criteria, a project is aimed, project funders have their own criteria about what they're going to fund, how they're going to fund, and most importantly, who's going to be funded from it. And you need to be very cognizant of that to make it work.
So what does a museum actually represent to you? Is it like a physical structure where there is, some artifacts which are telling stories, and there's a library, there's an archive? Or because you are also somebody who, you mentioned, right? Funding, you help museums, smaller museums also get funding so that it is a useful resource for communities. So what does, a museum represent to you? You're also an author, if you go to museums and archives for research. So I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. I think we can go back to a little bit to our conversation about books and about facts. And history teaches some fundamental facts. And as far as I'm concerned, museums are arbiters of the truth based on their factual evidence. The great thing about museums and history is that they can convey, because of their material culture and the power of the real, as I refer to it, that the world has not always been this way, and it will not always be the way in the future. People of all kinds move history. Sometimes they're not good people, sometimes they are good people, but they move the world in terrifying but also inspiring places. They also people with the idea that true knowledge of history is based on evidence. It's not based on political convenience or nostalgia. History doesn't care what you feel. It doesn't care what your opinions are. History is as it was in the past, based on evidence, and hopefully reinterpreted with integrity and with a sense of truth. And the other thing it represents to me is that they're places to engage with artifacts that were there in the past when you weren't, and associated with people long ago. And that's sort of removing that sense of ego. I think that's also an important part of a museum. Objects have a power embodied in their histories. You can have children who are not particularly engaged by history, but if you get objects in front of them and they can engage with history and they can engage with the objects, and it's explained to them about what the power of that object is, what its history, who's handled it, where's it's come from. They have the power to move and provoke and to engage a curiosity to question.
Is there any exhibition out of all the ones that you have curated that you would like to mention in this, which was difficult to curate, or which was a challenge in some way, which maybe you were not prepared for the challenge in that way?
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah,
they're
I
all
did.
unique.
Yeah, I did. There was a lovely exhibition called Oxfordshire in 50 Objects, and it was
Oh,
community collecting.
oh,
And it was celebrating 50 years of Oxfordshire Museum Services. And what we decided to do is to ask 50 members of staff who'd worked with the museum services if they would recommend one object from their collections to display,
fabulous.
and
That's
of
a
course,
great
yeah,
idea.
and of course to explain what it meant to them. And there was some terribly powerful and very moving stories that were associated with it. We had a few tears during the telling of those tales. Of course, objects are always about people and personal connections. And the other 25 of the 50 objects, one for each of the 50 years of Oxfordshire Museum Service, the 25 were chosen by community groups. And the challenge in that is that I thought perhaps each community group would send 2 or 3 representatives to choose an object from the 200,000 objects in the museum's collections. But no, they would sometimes send 20 people, and my task was then to get 20 people to agree which object in the collection would represent their community. And what should have been what I'd allocated, perhaps an hour between two people. Yeah, sometimes, Palumi, I was there 4 or 5 hours, and we'd
I
still
can
not agreed.
imagine.
It
I
was,
can imagine.
it was like trying to resolve Brexit.
I understand. Thank you for this. Now we'll move to the next part of the interview. So, Stephen, now we come to the third main thing, that you are involved with, and which is very fascinating, which is you take people on these, are they walking tours, or they're tours to specific places related to military history? Are they related to military history specific to the First and Second World War? And do you take them to battlefields like cemeteries or churches where there might be graves? Or do you take them to a war museum? Could you please tell us something about that? And how do you plan them? If they are, I mean, what's the process like again? Do you do a lot of research for it? And
Yeah. The tours themselves, there's such a lot to say here. The tours themselves are 4/5 of them are based on the English civil wars of the 17th century. All my work is museum related, so there's usually some objects that I can show people associated with them, and they're also military linked, and they also much linked to my specialist areas of knowledge, which are the First World War, but also the English Civil War that was fought in the 1640s in Britain. And close to where I live, there are 3 major battlefields of that Civil War that your audience may have heard of: Edgehill, Naseby. Those are the first and last battlefields of the First Civil War, and another battlefield, Cropredy Bridge. But I also have the Royalist Centre of Operations close to where I live in Oxford, in the city of Oxford. So my tours are aimed at the general audience. They last for about 2 to 2.5 hours. There are 2 choices. You can either tour them on foot, or you can tour them in the car. And the reason that they are to be toured by car is that it enables people of all abilities, physical abilities, to take part. I'm not keen on the idea that only the able-bodied should be able to take part. I like to enable, whether it's young children or people with disabilities, or people who are struggling a bit in older age, and that tends to be the case. And I'm doing 20 of these tours now on average a year,
Wow.
Which is exciting. And I always look to include important facets about the landscape. How has the landscape changed over the last 370 years? So I try and paint a picture of that. Was the road systems the same? Were the streams and rivers and flooded areas and the open field system from medieval times, was that still in place? So I try and recreate the landscape for them in their mind's eye, and we'll look at maps and orientate our way around. And I'll tell them a little bit about what happened in the battle, but I don't do too much. Otherwise, although I'm interested in military history, it can be a little bit tedious. So I'm very measured not to go into too much detail unless I'm working with a specialist group would then like me to talk in much, much greater detail. And that would certainly be the case. So as with all educational activities, of which this is one, it's about matching, isn't it? It's about matching where your audience is with the material that you want to give to them in a meaningful way. And my aim ultimately on these tours is that people want to go and find out more, are enthused about their heritage, understand more about the landscape, understand more about the importance of the civil wars. And I'd just like to say as well that, a bit like museums do, battlefields are just fantastic at bringing history to life. They enable people to make connections with earlier people, and they stimulate visitors to ask questions, much larger questions, than they normally would about the English Civil War. So it can be from the particular, so why soldiers volunteered, and how battle events impacted local communities, and what part did women play. It's the really big questions. Sometimes the first time that they've ever asked, even though they might be my age, in their late 50s and older, about monarchy in Britain. You know, we take it for granted that we've just passed the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in this country, as you know, but actually our monarch was removed in 1649 when Charles I was beheaded, and it brought about a constitutional crisis which changed our democracy forever. And of course, it was about the time, it was during that time that, you know, the Britons were coming to India to trade from the 1600s. And so it enables people to ask questions about monarchy, about democracy, about judiciary, about universal suffrage, about taxation, being a subject or being a citizen. All these questions come out because battlefields are the places where these issues are fought for, where people's values, you find out the strength of people's values in that context. And, you know, if you're a 21st century citizen, you need to know about about your role within democracy. The Civil War is a fantastic place to start that, and that's where it comes about. So just the final thing. So I not only use the landscape, I also use archaeology. I refer to myths and legends and make comparisons. I use memorials. And I always work with the original as much as possible. I've got several artifacts of my own from collections that I take out onto battlefields. So musket balls were fired, thousands of them at Edgehill, and I was fortunate enough to metal detect during an archaeological survey. And I've got a few of them. And there's a real power in opening up a cloth bag and pulling out some musket balls that were fired on this battlefield by someone who had volunteered from the south of England.
So I would love to come on one of your tours, and I'm sure there are.
Well, you'd be terribly welcome, of course, Balloon. You'd be very welcome.
Thank you so much. So I am sure you've traveled to India quite a few times, and I hope that, you know, if next time you're in India, we could organize a tour together or something. I mean, it need not be just. I will figure out something, I'm sure. Plan out something so that some of our listeners can come on one of our tours, maybe in Delhi, maybe somewhere else.
Yeah, that would be fabulous. Yeah, let's do that.
And to wind up this very important and interesting interview with you, because it's part of the Museum Memories project, share some memories of your, anything about the personality, anything about, the process of writing this book, or your exhibitions or your tours, anything that's very memorable for you that stands out, and 2-3 such memories if you could share with us.
Yeah, I will. It connects this book with cause. Is that I do a little bit of work with an organization in Britain called Little History of the Sikhs.
Yes.
And they engage with beyond the Sikh community in Britain. It's a wider audience, but it tends to focus on Sikh members. And a chap, Rav Singh, he started some tours in London, and they tour India-related sites. And he and I have worked on an Oxford-related History of the Sikhs tour. And of course, I've not mentioned it earlier, but Hardit Singh Malik was at Balliol College in Oxford, where I sort of connect with him, really, because I do work with the university from time to time and make connections with their colleges. And I've had such lovely memories of taking round groups of 30 people who knew Hardit Singh Malik on those tours. And we would take him to Balliol College. And I've got some fantastic photographs from his granddaughter, Santia, who's just been so instrumental in helping me to enable this book to come to publication, Santia Malik. And some of the photographs show Malik himself, Hardit Singh, in Balliol, below gateways. And I would have those photographs blown up and take our tourists into Balliol College and show them where Malik was photographed in 3 or 4 sites, at 3 or 4 sites on that place. And just the excitement from a group of people who know Malik, know the stories of Malik, and they are connected in with him. They're standing where he stood, evidently. And in beautiful, ethereal surroundings in Oxford. It's always been in sunshine, and it always makes for a magical moment. And there's just one lovely memory I just must share with you. There was one boy who came on the tour. He was about 8 years old, and I was holding up one of the photographs, and I was trying to build curiosity and to tantalize and tease and show show Malik. And I said, this is at Balliol. And I said, in a moment, I'm going to show you where this photograph was taken. And this 8-year-old straight away, he pointed to it and said, oh, it's over there.
That's exciting.
It's over there. And he walked over just by looking at the photograph. He'd made the connection between the architecture and the photograph. And then that lovely moment was augmented by the fact that the head gardener, he's been at Balliol for 30 years. He happened to be watching us, and he knew that there was an H.S. Malik photographic archive on the Balliol website. And without asking, he went into his office and printed out about 10 photographs for our party to take with them. And it was just a feel-good factor. And people making connections with their heritage, with an individual. And that's the great thing about Malik, is that he's just a great vehicle, understandable in his own words between East and West, and a really powerful person for that.
This is an exciting tour. I mean, I would have really loved to be on that particular one, to see that little kid and this gardener and everything. No, it's important, we regard history as something that's just there without realizing we are all part of history. We are, as you said, it's about people, right? It's about the stories that are associated with all of us and how we try to make them, dig out those stories and make them accessible to people. It's great that you have both people without who want to do the walking tours and who don't want to, so that it's more inclusive. And in terms of your research, you also mentioned that it's always facts and the evidence that the facts throw up. That's when you that determines your choice of the particular theme or the topic, right? Before we end, I would request you to kindly share the book, show us the book, if you could.
Yeah, this is the just a reminder. This is the version available in Britain. The Flying Sikh in India. Just a reminder, it's called same cover, but it's called Lion of the Skies. Lion of the Skies, but it's the same cover. And that photograph that's on the front of Malik is that's never been seen before. That's one of Sanchia Malik's archive, his granddaughter's archive that she very kindly lent, and it's lent itself perfectly for a front cover.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Best of luck with your the way the book is received and accepted. Your hard work. I hope it completely gets rewarded and people recognize Malik. And they definitely more. I mean, most of us would probably not even be aware of the role of Indians in the Second and the First World Wars. And we hope that we get to meet you soon in India. And we'd love to read your book and then talk to you in person. And thank you so much for taking out time for sharing all these important details. And we look forward to your next book also.
Thank you very much, Palumi, for this afternoon. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.